Hello, everybody. Here we are starting remote instruction for English 102. This is how it's going to be the rest of the semester. Um, Let me kind of outline the plan, and then I'm going to give you a little mini lecture related to poetry and kick you off with your first online assignment. So basically, the way it's going to work is I'm going to post a mini lecture around the time of our normal class meeting. So it'll be Tuesday morning and Thursday morning. There will be a little mini lecture, and then you'll find an assignment up there. The assignment will be named by the date that it was assigned. The due date for all assignments is going to be Sunday night at the end of the week. So essentially, you're going to watch two mini lectures. You're going to be given two assignments. You'll have all week to work on those assignments, and you'll need to submit them by Sunday night. And that's how that's going to look. Meanwhile, there's also going to be a discussion board that is going to be active, and I'm expecting you to jump on that discussion board a couple times a week and make some contributions either by asking questions about content, replying to your peers, and so forth. And that's going to be our kind of substitute for class discussion. It's a poor substitute, but hey, we're doing our best. We got this coronavirus thing going. I don't know if you heard about it. So that's basically the idea. We'll still have the essay one. I know many of you had conferences that got canceled, and the class, the school getting shut down has kind of got in the way of that. So I do have the capacity to do conferences through Canvas, and I will be creating a sign-up sheet to resume those conferences next week. The deadline for your essay one is probably going to be next Sunday evening. I'll remind you that even when that gets submitted, I will grade those, and when you get it back with the grade, you can still revise. So I will I'm going to have kind of a conference sign-up sheet on an ongoing basis. Every week, you'll have an opportunity to sign up to meet with me and just talk about your essay, the test, anything like that. So that's going to kind of take the place of office hours rather than being available at X time. I'm just going to have more availability and give you an opportunity to just sign up for an appointment. So keep your eyes open for that. I will email it to you and also post it in Canvas once that's ready to go. So that'll kind of start up next week. Let's see what else. There will still be an exam. The exams that have been assigned, those will still be going on. The research assignment, all those things will still be there. And I will give you more detail about how that's going to work. Probably with the exams, those will be more open book, open note, and I'll just kind of have to write a different sort of test that makes sense in that modality. But I really haven't given it too much thought, to be honest. I hope everybody's safe. I hope you're spending time with your people. I hope that you are social distancing. This is a very serious thing, and I would not want to learn that you guys are going out on spring break and partying and stuff like that. I will definitely have to call your parents if I learn about any of that. So let's not do it. I'm recording these like mini lectures, so you're going to notice that everything's going to be PG rated. It's going to be very difficult for me to do it that way, and probably not as fun for you. So we'll see how it goes. All right, so here we go. We're going to talk about poetry. Let me do the thing. See, now my face is down there. Isn't that cool? Okay, so last class we spent most of our time talking about dramatic situation. By the way, this PowerPoint is available in Canvas now if you'd like to download this at any time. Last class we talked a lot about dramatic situation, which, as you'll recall, involves the idea that there's the persona, who's essentially the person talking in the poem. Then there's the auditor, who is the person being addressed in the poem or the group being addressed, and then the exigency, which is, well, what are the circumstances that inspired the poem? We started talking a little bit about diction and tone, but that's where I want to pick up, and that's what your assignment is going to be that's due on Sunday. So diction, as you'll recall, is just a word that means word choice. Why did you choose that word and not a different word? And tone has to do with what is the kind of feeling, or how would you describe that diction in terms of the feeling and what it evokes and so forth. And it's not unlike when we talk about a person communicating with a particular tone of voice, although in poetry, it's not done with the intonation of your voice. It's done strictly through the choice of the word. So then we talked about a few of these terms already, but we talked about denotation versus connotation. Denotation being the literal meaning of a word, and words might have very similar or almost identical denotation, but then have very different connotations, which is the feeling or associations that get evoked by a word. poetry does a lot of work with connotation, and that's what we're going to kind of focus on in a moment. A couple other words that you might want to be familiar with that we're not going to talk a whole lot about right now are etymology. That has to do with kind of the history of a word, what language it came from. We call that what is its derivations and so forth. English is a mongrel language that was created mostly out of a combination of French and German. And I have a much longer lecture about that involves cuss words and so forth. And I'm afraid to say that I'm not willing to put that lecture into video and put it out there for the world. So you might not get my cuss words lecture, but perhaps another time. But when we think about etymology, that's often related to other issues with connotation that we'll be talking about. Neologism is when someone invents a brand new word. A good example of that is in Paradise Lost. Milton describes how Satan is cast out of heaven when he revolts against God, and so he's down in hell, and he decides that he would rather suffer and rule in hell than serve God in heaven. So he and his demons build this big castle, and he names the castle Pandemonium, which is a word that he made up. And pandemonium, pan means everywhere, and then the other word there is demons. So basically, Pandemonium, the name of this castle, means demons everywhere. Well, now we use it to describe 3-year-olds running around a house like wreaking havoc. That's pandemonium now. But it's a word that John Milton invented, right? So sometimes poets will invent language. Imagery is a word that comes up an awful lot when we're talking about poetry, and it's basically using language to reference concrete sensory details. So it's a concrete description of what something looks like, sounds like, feels like, smells like. Technically, imagery is only supposed to reference concrete language that has to do with seeing what something looks like, but we often use it for all 5 senses anyways, and I'm comfortable. I will be using the word imagery to reference all the senses because I don't think we have to learn a bunch of words about that. Okay, so here's what I really want to get to, though. I want us to spend some time talking about connotation and thinking about how to find the language to say some stuff about poetry related to connotation. So I'm introducing you to these different spectra that help us describe diction in poetry. And so as you go down the list there that you can see, we've got formal or academic on the one hand, colloquial on the other. So this is a spectrum to describe language. Colloquial language would be common, everyday language that you'd use in your neighborhood, doesn't require any special education to understand it. It's down to earth. It's includes slang, et cetera, et cetera. Might mix different languages. Spanglish is kind of colloquial, right? Formal and academic would be, big words that impress people and using the language of the discipline appropriately and those kinds of things, right? So when people choose words, this is one of the spectrums that they're kind of choosing in terms of the connotation of the diction. Do I want to sound fancier and more formal, or do I want to sound more down to earth and colloquial, right? Presidential candidates are often, when they're running for office, trying to kind of find that right line where they sound colloquial and down to earth, but they also sound like they know what they're talking about. Poetic versus prosaic. So poetic would be language that's, sounds like it belongs in poetry. It's elegant, it's refined. Prosaic would be, again, a more kind of simpler, down-to-earth kind of language, right? Modern versus old-fashioned. Privileged dialect versus marginalized dialect. So there we're thinking about, so I think a good example of that would be Theme from English B, which we'll talk about in a second, where we talk about how Langston Hughes actually wants to use a kind of language that sounds black because he's black and he wants to create a poetry for the African-American voice. And so he actually decides to use language that represents his more marginalized dialect rather than the language only of the privileged dialect, which would be the kind of white upper middle class. Then you got euphony, which basically means it sounds nice, sounds elegant, versus cacophony, which means it sounds ugly and crude. And then you have concrete versus abstract. So is it using concrete images or is it relying on abstractions? Okay, so this is kind of, these spectra give us language to think about poetry, and this is what your assignment is going to ask you to do, is to kind of pick a poem and find ways to describe specific word choice that gets made. So I want to model that. So, theme for English B, this is what we read last time. I apologize that the poem's so small in the slide here, but I just wanted to have it up where we could look at it. And so, the example that we looked at is that I want to focus on this kind of privileged dialect versus marginalized dialect. There's this whole part where he says, it's not easy to know what's true for you or me at 22 my age, but I guess it's what I feel and see and hear. Harlem, I hear you. Hear you, hear me, we too, you, me, talk this page. I hear New York too, me who. So I don't even know how to deliver that because my white voice can't do it justice. But what that's an attempt to do is to kind of have a word choice and a diction that matches the language of kind of bop jazz instrumentation, and to try to capture that kind of in language. So that would be an example of him trying to use an association, a connotation that evokes an African American art form, and so that would be a point that we can make there. So some of these other things that we could talk about formal versus colloquial, where he's being asked to write an assignment, and he kind of sometimes does use pretty formal language, but he's also writing a poem in response to his professor. So as we look through this, we could say we mentioned this idea that he gives directions to his house. So we could look at the word choice here where he says, I step down the hill that lead into Harlem through a park. Then I cross St. Nicholas, 8th Avenue, 7th, and I come to the Y. So this is a very colloquial decision in terms of word choice, because he's essentially walking us to his front door, which is a very kind of everyday sort of conversation to have, as opposed to using kind of higher, fancy, more formal academic language. So that's a couple examples of how we maybe could have used the discussion from last class using some of these kind of spectra of diction to kind of pull out some word choices. Now I want us to look at this poem that was assigned but we haven't discussed yet, which is My Papa's Waltz. So here's the poem. I'm going to read it. The whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy, but I hung on like death. Such waltzing was not easy. We romped until the pans slid from the kitchen shelf. My mother's countenance could not unfrown itself. The hand that held my wrist was battered on one knuckle. Every step you missed, my right ear scraped the buckle. You beat time on my head with palm caked hard by dirt, and then waltzed me off to bed, still clinging to your shirt. So, this poem is describing a dad who kind of gets home from work, and he's probably a little drunk. We've got the reference to whiskey on your breath, and et cetera, et cetera. And then dances with his son kind of in a clumsy, drunkenly way around the kitchen, smashing stuff around, and his son's getting kind of roughed up and scraped on his belt buckle a little bit and so forth, and then waltzes him off to bed, puts him to bed. So that seems to be what this is about. And if we were to say what's the denotation of this poem, the denotation, if we were to kind of paraphrase what the denotation is, it's describing that event of his father coming home and dancing. However, some people read this poem and what they see is actually a poem about abuse, and that comes out more in the connotation rather than the denotation. So, why would people say it's actually a poem about abuse? That in fact his papa's waltz was not him dancing with his son, but it was him coming home and beating his son. And so now we have the adult writing this poem, reflecting on that. So what are some examples of that? So how can I use these different spectra of diction to kind of help draw attention to that? Well, one thing I will say is that there's a lot of concrete detail and not a lot of abstractions. He doesn't say stuff like, I loved my father, or my father was kind. Those are abstractions. Love, kindness. There is no description in an abstract way that tells you what it felt like to go through this dance or this abuse. Instead, what we get is only concrete details, such as the whiskey being so heavy on his breath that it's actually making the boy dizzy. Pans flying off the kitchen shelves. The mother's countenance that could not unfrown itself. The battered knuckles. I mean, again, so that image of the battered knuckle is a concrete image. And what's the connotation of that? Well, it's a connotation that suggests, well, on the one hand, it might suggest working class. So there you go. On the other hand, it could suggest beating someone up in abuse. Okay, so the assignment that I'm going to give you is to choose one of the other poems, and you'll read the assignment, and you're essentially going to pull out some examples like this and analyze the diction.